Dear students, President Ramos-Horta, Ambassador, dear Inge Kaul, this is the fourth time the Hertie School co-hosts the Kapuscinski Development Lecture Series, and we're delighted. We do that with our partners from UNDP and the European Commission. The project is a joint initiative of the European Commission, the United Nations Development Programme, and the Hertie School, and the project is funded by the European Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, for the Hertie School of Governance, having this lecture with such a distinguished international speaker tonight is something that is close to what we do and what we want to achieve at the school. I remember that 4 years ago, 5 years ago probably, when we started to discuss this cooperation, I wanted to understand better who Richard Kapuscinski was and why that lecture series was named after him. So I started to read, and I remember coming across a quote which I often quote. It's not directly related to tonight's topic, but it's the overarching theme of development and poverty he captures in a brutal sentence that every Hertie School student, every member of the Hertie community can easily identify with. And I quote from The Shadow of the Sun from 2001. "People are not hungry because there is no food in the world. There is plenty of it. There is a surplus, in fact. But between those who want to eat and the bursting warehouses stands a tall obstacle indeed: politics." It's a very powerful way of describing the world poverty problem in 2 lines. There is enough for everyone, we can't share, and the reason is politics. Period. What's the next problem? What we want to do at the Hertie School is to bridge the world of politics, the world of the third sectors, the world of private activities to solve the very, very basic problems we all face, whether it's poverty, whether it's hunger, whether it's security, whether it's digital governance or international security. And we know that politics is always the core problem. And this is why we sit here. This is why we study together. And this is why we have distinguished people like you, President Ramos-Horta, a Nobel Peace Prize winner here tonight, to share your thoughts with you on a very special topic which is close to your heart, but where politics also plays a major role. The evening is very simple. After my quick introduction, I'm happy to pass the floor to a close friend and colleague, the ambassador of the European Union, the representative here in Berlin, Richard Kühnel. We will then have Karen Cirillo from UNDP addressing you and introducing tonight's speaker. Then we will have the main lecture. And afterwards, I'm particularly delighted that another very close friend, colleague at the Hertie School, adjunct professor since the very first days of the school, our very own Professor Inge Kaul is with us. She was the first director of the Human Development Report Office at UNDP, and so there is no other person better qualified to host tonight's discussion than you, Inge, and I'm delighted that you will later on, after the introductory lecture, take the floor and moderate the discussion. So, the only thing I can end with is, as usual, let's try to learn something tonight, and I look forward to fascinating ideas, discussions, and conversations. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for these very friendly words, dear President. Excellency, what a pleasure and what an honor to have you here in Berlin, Germany, one of your favorite countries in Europe, as you have said before, at least when it comes to counting the many times that you're here, Professor. Dear colleagues, it's a fantastic opportunity. I'm very pleased and honored that as European Commission, we sometimes, you spoke about politics, we sometimes do things right. And I think hosting this series of lectures, nobody would deny us that at least on this one, I think we've been doing something very right and something very important. You mentioned, President, it's the 4th time at your prestigious place that we have this lecture, but actually globally it's 100 times that we have done this. And according to the figures I have here, we have reached some 130,000 people through this series of lectures, which we're doing together with UNDP, which is our very, very good and close partner in doing this at prestigious universities around Europe. So the lecture honors the legacy, the name of this talented Polish journalist, writer, Ryszard Kapuscinski. Thanks to his famous reportages and books describing developing countries on all continents, he became known to the world as the world chronicler, or as the voice of the poor. What matters is that he belongs to a category of reporters who, through their work, have gained unanimous recognition from their peers. Kapuscinski is often quoted as saying that life is truly known only to those who suffer, lose, endure adversity, and stumble from defeat to defeat. Today, the words solidarity, partnership are more relevant than ever, and I think these days and these weeks we have to think much about solidarity and partnership in the world. We live in a world where everything is interconnected, the challenges are global, and still some believe that they can find egoistic, nationalistic solutions to global problems. In Europe, we do not believe in this. The EU is committed to remaining a global leader in development and in finding multilateral solutions to global problems. Of course, the world around is not standing still, and so we cannot be standing still when it comes to making the necessary changes at a global level. And we've been speaking before that we also have the privilege that it was you, President, who also suggested the European Union for its Nobel Prize. So I think we owe it a lot also to your foresight, because I think we shouldn't forget that the EU was not created just as an end in itself, just to help Europe, the European continent, to come out of war and misery. But it is also a force to change the world very much, to become a better and a more stable world. I remember when I was working at the United Nations, we had Secretary General Kofi Annan, and he always spoke of this triangle of relationship between peace, development, and human rights. Now, when we look at the agenda of the last decades, I think we've come some way on the development agenda, not as far as we would have liked in some places, but at the same time we did have quite some results and achievements. If we look at the human rights agenda, still huge issues around the world, and we are far, and maybe in some places even further from coming to a situation which we want to achieve. And when we look at peace and security, well, we have not achieved it either. So I think what President Enderlein said at the beginning, it's about politics. It is a global commitment and a global responsibility to change politics, that we can move forward on this triangle: development, security, and human rights, to go in the right direction. And who better can speak to us than you, President, Nobel laureate, yourself? You have led your country out of a most difficult situation of war. You have led it into the path of development, into improving a human rights situation. Also, your country is not there yet, but I think you have done a lot to help not only your country to bring it on the right way, but also to set an example. And still you are a voice globally when you work still with the United Nations. Questions of peace building are on your agenda. I think we can learn a lot from you tonight. I'm pleased and privileged to be here, and I think all of us are eagerly awaiting your comments. Before you can take the floor, I want to pass the floor to Karen Cirillo from UNDP, our partner in this project, and I wish all of you a fascinating evening with our guest speaker of tonight. Thank you very much.
Hello. First, a very big thank you to the Hertie School of Governance for hosting us for the 4th time. It's very impressive to see so many people in the room, both students and people outside of the school. It's really great to have you here. And also a big thank you to the European Commission, who has been our partner for 10 years. We're celebrating our 10th anniversary this year, so it's been a very fruitful partnership, and we look forward to continuing. As those before me mentioned, the Kapuscinski Development Lectures brings prominent speakers to European universities to discuss important issues facing our world and gives students the opportunity to discuss these issues with the speakers. We are also welcoming an online audience of people who are watching our live stream. So if you're watching and you would like to ask questions, you can follow at hashtag KapTalks, KAPTALKAS, and you can ask your questions on Twitter. We'll be tracking for them. Now on to our lecturer for tonight. Thank you very much for being here with us. We are honored to welcome His Excellency José Ramos-Horta, former president of Timor-Leste and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, here to speak on peace building, our roles and responsibilities. He is a very appropriate person to speak on this topic. In fact, he has been called a founding father of the first new democracy of the millennium. Not only does he have academic degrees in peace studies and human rights law, but he has actually put those educational ideas into practice. For many years, he traveled the world pleading for the cause of the people of his country. He advocated dialogue with the occupier. He, in 1992, presented a peace plan. And in this plan, he provided concrete proposals for humanitarian cooperation and a growing UN presence. This laid the groundwork for independence, which was eventually realized in 2001. And then he served as foreign minister following independence, then prime minister, and finally president from 2007 to 2012. He has worked closely with resistance movements and the United Nations, seeing issues of peace from all sides of the conversation. He's uniquely positioned to speak on the positive role of the UN, as well as its challenges and its failures. But most importantly, he recognizes how important peace is to achieving progress and for countries' future development. In the context of today's push for the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as a constantly changing and sometimes dangerous world social climate, he will speak to how we can ensure the world shares responsibilities for our collective future. I'd like to welcome him. Thank you.
Good evening. I will not be too formal, thanking everybody, mention everybody's name, because it will take more time, so I will go straight to the topic. I have not prepared a speech as such. I struggled with it yesterday, today, but I have not been able to come with a formal speech, and probably I don't need it, because I lived this topic, taking peace building to the world. I lived with the UN, either as an observer or as a victim of indifference of the international community, or as a beneficiary of the UN when the UN acted. Later, also as an agent of the UN, deployed in West Africa by the Ban Ki-moon. And then later, Ban Ki-moon asked me to chair a panel on UN peace operation. So with all of that, do I need to write something? I can just share with you my inconsequential views. But first and foremost, probably, I will begin with my own country, because Timor-Leste, where we are today, is obviously thanks to the determination of the people to fight for freedom, regardless of the cost, the consequences. But also, we will be still fighting, and indefinitely, forever, if it were not for the mobilization of conscious of people, of civil society, and of governments, and the role of the UN. So it's a combination of many factors that led to the changes in Indonesia itself and in Timor-Leste. If I'm asked, a few days ago I was asked by a journalist to do a balance of the past 15 years since independence, I would say the greatest success of all has been national reconciliation, healing the wounds of divided communities, of a divided country. Because evil or wrongs were not only on one side, in that we, the Timorese, we all angels, the other side were wrong. Or only the people on the resistance side, on the right side of history, we were the ones who were committed no errors, and those on the other side were all wrong. Or all the crimes committed were all on the Indonesian side and nothing on the Timor side. So we are not going to judge anyone. We received the gift of independence, of freedom, with courage, with honesty. We healed the wounds among Timorese people. But also we healed the wounds with our Indonesian brothers and sisters. Timor-Leste is predominantly Catholic country, 98% practicing Catholic. Indonesia, as you know, the largest Muslim majority in the world. We were, I don't like to use the word, we were enemies. I never use this word. We were on different sides of trenches, different sides of history. Indonesia was on one side, we were another trench. There were people who killed on both sides, of course, vast majority on our side, the weaker, the smaller, but they also lost people. And so we also extend a hand of friendship with Indonesia, and Indonesia didn't reject it. And sometimes it's easier for the victor powers, the victor side, to show humility. It's not always, because sometimes you win, even in election, you have a democratic free election, you win, instead of making a magnanimous, diplomatic, elegant gesture to the other side, you gloat over their defeat. But easier if you have won, you've succeeded, to show wisdom and humility and embrace the other side. But those who perceived, who feel that they lost, it's very difficult for them to forgive or to accept. So you have to do extra effort for the other side to accept that they did not succeed. So we did every effort to show respect to Indonesia. And the Indonesian side showed their statesmanship, turn around, walk back towards us at the bridge, shook hands, and since we have developed the best possible relationship of any two countries in Southeast Asia or anywhere in Asia. I guarantee any researcher, a scholar who wish to review relationship between any given two countries in Asia, even in Southeast Asia itself, you will not find two that have better relation than Timor-Leste and Indonesia. And you can look even on practical policy matters day to day. For instance, immediately after independence, when Timor-Leste has zero money, Indonesian authorities encourage Indonesian universities to welcome Timorese students paying only local fees, not as foreign students. And this continues till this very day. Timorese passport holders do not need a visa for Indonesia and vice versa. We have thousands of Timorese students studying in Indonesia, and many thousands of Indonesians coming back to live and work in Timor-Leste. So this is the relationship between the largest Muslim majority country in the world, Indonesia, 260, 270 million people, and one of the smallest in the world, Timor-Leste, 98% Catholic. So we were at war, we had the conflict, and very different in the sense of history, spiritual belief, and yet we have the best possible relationship. So this is, for me, the most successful that I can say after all these years. And it was quick. And that's partly because throughout the struggle of the people of Timor-Leste, never once we were tempted to demonize the other side. Demonize them as a people, demonize them as a different religious community. And never once our fighters, we did have a very active fighting group, never once target Indonesian civilians, not one, throughout the 24 years of struggle. So this is important because if you demonize others as a people, as an ethnicity or religion, to serve your a purpose, you demonize people, you literally indoctrinate, well, very difficult later to switch off when time comes. With us, it was not necessary to change discourse with the people. We always said Indonesians were our brothers and sisters. And there was pressure on the Timorese leadership to push for an international tribunal to try the crimes of the past. We, as Timorese people, we rejected. And it doesn't mean there was no criticism of us leaders who rejected a special tribunal to try the crimes of the past. Yes, we had a civil society that criticized, and, but we explain. And these policies have what enable us then also to focus on the post-conflict building of the state, state institution that didn't exist, economy that didn't exist. The country was, we had a population traumatized, hundreds of thousands uprooted, displaced. We have to tackle the situation in every front, simultaneously. You cannot say one is more a priority than others. And we ourselves, Timorese, we are not super organizers. We improvise a lot. And we don't like doing things in a very long term. We work better under pressure. If it's tomorrow, yeah, we have to do it, it's tomorrow. But if you say, well, 6 months from now, well, why you are such in a hurry if 6 months, you know? So, and so we have to do things, but to achieve all of that, we had exceptional international solidarity, whether member states, countries, whether international multilateral institutions, the United Nations with all its agencies, or the European Union, and individual member countries of the European Union, our neighbors like Australia, Japan, China, and so on. So it's not like we did it ourselves. No, we had tremendous support from governments, from institutions, but also from civil societies, local governments from like neighboring countries like Australia. And this is, I would say, the greatest achievement. And I would say this year we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the holding of a referendum on self-determination. It was that referendum, August 30, 1999, that resulted in Timor and Indonesia parting ways. Independence came 2 years later after a short period, 2 years of transition with a UN administration. So I want to touch on that. The UN Security Council in 1999 authorized a 2-year UN transition mission to Timor-Leste. It was the first time the UN undertook the responsibility of governing a country, a territory, and preparing for independence. The Special Representative of Secretary General was the equivalent to the Prime Minister. He also had almost exclusive legislative authority and even judiciary. So very strong mandate. But it had only 2 years. I tried to argue in New York at the UN, and I remember talking with the Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping, that Timor needed a 5-year transition, and he said, if you manage to convince the Security Council 2 years transition, you'll be lucky. But also in my own country, many of my compatriots thought 5 years was too long, and 2 years was already enough. So we had a 2-year transition. But can you imagine a country devoid of institutions, profoundly traumatized, a people uprooted, and independence to take place within 2 years? Only the UN Security Council could think that that was possible. And this was a mandate given to Kofi Annan and to Sergio Vieira de Mello. So they were there for 2 years, 2 years left, and what was the country left behind? Well, very just a skeleton semblance of a state, because it's impossible. You know, Timor-Leste was not Namibia. For all the ills of the apartheid regime, they left behind institutions that were inherited by SWAPO, that was had far more resources, human resources than us. It was not even Zimbabwe. When Northern Rhodesia transitioned to Zimbabwe at independence, well, ZANU, Robert Mugabe, received an organized economy, an organized country, institutions. We didn't. And because there was a period of violence, so everybody scattered, the administration that was there broke down, the economy ceased to function. We had to start from zero, and we did. Of course, member states, international community stayed on to help building on the institutions of the state, and we are still doing it today. And Freedom House, a Washington-based think tank, conservative, the other day, well, a few weeks ago, a few months ago, in one of the second report on democracies in Southeast Asia, classified Timor-Leste as the #1, the best functioning democracy in Southeast Asia. And I can say, you know, what is a remarkable indicator of this is that in 2017, we had elections. Absolutely peaceful, zero incident of violence. But it did not produce an absolute majority for any party. The largest, the most voted party tried to form government, didn't succeed, went into a minority government, but then was not able to survive in the parliament. The program was voted down, the budget was rejected. So, following the constitution, the president consulted with everybody. We had early elections a year later. Again, it did not produce a result like that, an absolute majority for any party. Like in Spain, last year, they had to do, I think, 3 elections in 1 year, and to some extent here in similar situation in Germany, and in many other European countries like Belgium. And so current governing government now is a 3-party coalition, not the most voted party, because the most voted party could not have enough support in the parliament, so there was a coalition. And that coalition, we have a political system similar to German, the semi-presidential system. The power rests with the prime minister, but the president has some authority in that he can veto a budget. He can block a government. So we had this impasse for many months. The budget was first vetoed by the president, went back to the parliament, they sent back to him, he relented and voted. Incredible tension, voices are raised, insults written in the social media, but all happen only in the confines of the parliament or in the social media. Zero political violence. So a test of our maturity of our democracy, maturity of our political institutions. Other than that, producing majorities or no majorities. And recently, I spoke to some teenagers and children in one of the private schools in Timor. And some of the young people are complaining about what is this democracy of Timor? The president is not, they express frustration. And they say, yes, that's consequence of the constitution we wanted, consequence of the democracy we wanted. Democracy comes with these consequences, in that sometimes you don't have a stable governing body. Yes, we could adopt one-party system. Maybe North Korea would be more effective, or maybe some other one part. But I don't think anyone in my country would consider that at all. As also, in my country, the idea of death penalty is just something completely out of our mind vocabulary. We are the only country in Southeast Asia, and actually one of the very few in whole of Asia, that does not have death penalty, and we don't have life in prison. Maximum prison sentence, I think, is 25 years, or 20 or 25, and no death sentence. And it never occurred to anyone. And that is in contrast with most of Asia. South Korea, dynamic democracy, Japan have a death penalty. Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Philippines, I don't know whether they have reintroduced it. They had before, they banned, and then I think there have been discussion about reintroduce. I don't know whether they did. And then the rest, most of Asia have. Now I will turn to the United Nations itself. In 2017, a new Secretary General was sworn in, Antonio Gutteres. You could not have a more qualified person than that. In the sense, he was Prime Minister of his country. He dealt with concrete situations in his own country or in overseas missions, like Portugal participating in NATO operations, UN operations in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in many other fields. And then he was 10 years as High Commissioner for Human Rights. and he did an extraordinary mission as High Commissioner. And that's why he literally unanimously had the endorsement of the General Assembly and the Security Council. He was sworn in, took office the same time as the new president of the United States. And he took office at the same time as Europe is absorbed, partly with Brexit, or pretty much with Brexit, and the whole uncertainty in the rest of Europe. He takes office at a time when many of our traditional, generous development partners have reallocated the development budget to security, to humanitarian, other humanitarian challenges. And as we all know, traditionally only 5 countries that always allocated, committed development assistance, ODA, to about 0.7%. Traditionally Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands. But even Finland already no longer 0. I think they changed that. Remarkably, UK under David Cameron allocated 0.7, the only G7 country that has done that. I'm just not familiar whether under Theresa May, UK has continued. But it was the only industrialized country, G7 country, that under David Cameron increased to 0.7. But since the economic financial crisis, 2008, 2009, every major donor country has decreased their development assistance. And that assuming that development assistance, ODA, has had real impact in the lives of the people it was supposed to help in the course of the last 40, 50 years. So the new Secretary General, the UN, is dealing with this current international situation. And it's not only the political, social, and some security challenge in Europe. Well, look in Asia. 5 billion people that inhabit the Asia region. Our planet has 8 billion people today. By 2030, it will be 9 billion people. Just imagine the pressure, just for our very basic survival, the pressure on water resources, the pressure on land, just to produce enough. I don't even mention the impact on industries, overfishing, depleting fish stocks around the world. I don't mention illegal logging, destroying forests around the world. So, because we cannot look at the UN dissociated from all of these problems that are not only traditional security problems, but non-conventional, non-traditional security challenges, namely environment, namely increasing inequality, extreme poverty. And this is where the UN is today. Less resources, greater tensions among the P5 countries, the permanent 5 or Security Council, and the more. Just yesterday, a few days ago, India and Pakistan increased tension. South China Sea, increasingly militarized. China claimed most of South China Sea. The US challenged that it is stand for freedom of navigation. Little UK sent 2 modern warships as if the Chinese would be so intimidated by that. Australia loyally joined the UK, also sent a little warship to South China Sea. The Chinese, I'm sure, very, very nervous about that. And, instead of searching for diplomatic solutions, the first reaction from everyone, let's send warships. And my fear is that, yes, I don't think anyone will be irrational that will on purpose fire some. But yeah, accidents always happen. A more nervous pilot, because they will all fly in the region, yeah, might fire a missile. And then all hell break loose. Fortunately, so far, we have not yet had any major. But look at what happened in Kashmir just the other day. What that can lead to. So, are we to expect the UN, or are we to hold the UN responsible to manage all of these challenges? Where is the European Union? Where are regional organizations? Who is dealing with Venezuela? Organization of American States? In the past, in some situations, they are quite effective. Who is dealing with Myanmar? ASEAN, fulfilling its responsibilities in addressing Myanmar. And if we look at the regional organizations that should support the whole multilateral system, the UN system, I would say, for all the difficulties, the limitations, the African Union and their sub-regional organizations have been the most in the forefront of taking responsibilities in addressing African conflicts, like Somalia. After the US withdrawal, Somalia was abandoned. It was the Africans who decided to go and taking casualties there. Later, the European Union started financing African peacekeepers in Somalia. And in our report, the high-level independent panel on UN peace operations, we argue with the Security Council, particularly the P5, that whenever there are circumstances, security circumstances, in the African continent that require immediate response, and the first responders are either African Union as such or the regional organization, like in the case of Mali, would be ECOWAS. The UN Security Council should provide assessed contribution to African peacekeepers, because they might have the manpower, but they don't have the resources. And that was difficult to convince the P5 to provide direct, we call it assessed contribution to the first responders, in this case to African Union forces fighting in Mali, for instance. I think I should end here because I would prefer to leave time for discussion. But I will a few more points about the role of the UN. Myself and 15 colleagues, all of them tremendous experience at the level of Assistant Secretary Generals, we were asked by Ban Ki-moon to review all the UN peace operations and to provide recommendations to how to make the UN more effective in anticipating and preventing conflicts, in mediating conflicts, and in deploying forces faster. So we did a report, we presented to Ban Ki-moon end of June 2015, and Secretary General Antonio Gutteres, in the last 2 years since he took office, has made every effort to respond not only to our recommendations, but to other reports, Women, Peace and Security, and the Peacebuilding Architecture. These are the three main reports, recommendations that form the basis of the Secretary General effort to streamline, to delegate, to make the UN more effective, more responsive. So the Secretary General can do, he does, what is his responsibility, which is limited. And no matter how much reform the Secretary General does to respond to the needs, the challenges, but in the end, as I said many times during the discussions we had in our preparing our report, we may produce a report that would merit a summa cum laude in some university. But if member states do not endorse and act on them, our report will gain dust, like many PhD dissertations who read them. And particularly if you have a dissertation that goes to the UN library, is even worse. But fortunately, it looks like the Secretary General, at least what concerns the Secretary General himself, they are doing at the level of senior management in New York a remarkable effort in adapting the UN to the challenges of today. Because the security challenge of 15 years ago, when a first report was done, ordered by, I think, Boutros Ghali, it was Lakhdar Brahimi of Algeria who produced the first well-known Brahimi report. Only 15 years later, the nature of security threats, the challenge facing the UN, changed. Look at Mali. The challenge in Mali is no longer a traditional UN peacekeeping. It is a counter-insurgency operation almost. The UN was not, is not up to undertake counter-insurgencies. How can the UN prevent conflict? How can the UN mediate? And how can it resolve conflict if it becomes entangled in insurgency? And this is what's happening in Mali. And last but not least, the role of civil society, of individuals. The Secretary General of the UN, he doesn't command the 6th or 7th fleet. He is not the leader of the largest economy of the world. His power rests, A, on his ability to build bridges with the powers that be in the UN. In today's age, 21st century, the power of Secretary General rests on the civil society of people around the world to support him, to support the ideals of the UN, to contribute, and I say not to resolve, to contribute towards preventing conflicts, towards resolving conflicts, and to build a sustainable peace around the world. But that is only possible if member states are persuaded by their own people that we must do better. Otherwise, it's all artificial. You know, you have the Secretary General sitting in New York. He has a hostile US president, or indifferent. And then you have an European Union, very important, absorbed with domestic problems, from Brexit to Italy, to Austria, to Poland. So what can the Secretary General do? And then we all blame the UN, failures of the UN. Yeah, the UN has failed a few times, has failed in Syria, has failed in Sudan. But failed, why? Well, ask the powers that be. Don't ask the poor Secretary General. Ask the powers that be why we are failing. We have failed in Syria, we're failing. But I also have to say we cannot blame everybody else. if we had failed in Timor-Leste, if today I was standing here and my country at war, I would not have the dishonesty and the audacity to blame the UN or to blame someone. No, we, national leaders, we failed. As we failed in 2006 when we had a major security and political challenge. But we addressed it. We were not ashamed to ask international help. I personally called the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Portugal, New Zealand, Australia, of course, in consultation with all my colleagues, yes, asked them to come to help, and they came. South Sudan, Congo, Central African Republic. Are we blaming all, everybody else and not ourselves, leaders of the country? My point is to say prevention easier said than done, but prevention of conflict begin at home. Who are the best actors to prevent conflicts? What are the best prescriptions to prevent conflicts in a society? Well, policies that are inclusive, that embrace everybody, that leave no one outside, leave no one behind. Policies that are not seen as discriminating against one group or another. Inclusive policies, embracing everyone, particularly if you are in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious community, society. That is prevention. Others can help, but responsibility number one comes from us on the ground, those who are the leaders of the country. Because when you look at some of the conflicts around the world, why it's happening, why there is a civil war, well, maybe because a particular ethnic group saw that the central government, either the majority or the minority but in power, deny them their language, discriminate them in opportunities, education, of economics, and all of that. It's as simple as that. Because some leaders in our world, instead of seeing ethnic, cultural, religious diversity as a blessing, they see it as a threat. So you start discriminating, you are suspicious of a particular group, yeah, you create more problems. And then they fight back. And then violence escalates. So prevention comes from us. The UN, the European Union, other neighbors, they can help. But the first actors in prevention of conflicts are national actors. So I stop here and we continue with the conversation.
So, Mr. President, thank you very much for your very inspiring, but also at the same time very challenging speech, because you told us much depends on us. So I would like to suggest that we have a few very brief exchange between the two of us while you think about your questions, and then we will immediately open up the floor for discussion. When you were talking, I was thinking of the African proverb, which says that when the elephants fight, the grass suffers. So I would suggest that we leave the current rivalry between the superpowers and the militarization that they undertake for a second part, and start first with the activities of the UN and the peace operations on the ground. And I found it very interesting to hear the lessons you draw from the experiences of your own country. When I compare what you did during fighting for your independence and gaining your independence, I was thinking, are the current peace operations not wrongly structured so that we cannot move towards reconciliation, working together, being inclusive, working together with the government? Because I think of the situation in Sudan, and here are some people who know probably Sudan better than I do. But in Sudan, when I look at the UNDP country program, I get the feeling everything is more or less normal. One does development, but sort of limited around Khartoum. When I then look to Darfur, I see thousands and thousands of peacekeepers more or less sitting there, observing, sometimes taking a stroll through the country. But peacekeeping and rehabilitation, humanitarian assistance even, and development is totally separated. When you look at Mali, you find a very similar situation. So since we are at or you are visiting us at a very opportune moment in time, because we are now, Germany now has a seat in the Security Council for the next 2 years. So I thought it would be great if you can probably offer some further suggestions on how to improve peace operations on the ground. And I would like to encourage you to do that, because I think as a UN official myself and having worked on the ground, I think you have a lot of freedom to do better than the Security Council tells you to do. You have freedom to invent, to be innovative, to link to the government, to do more development and peacekeeping operations in tandem. So what suggestions would you have, which probably some of you can note down and which we then can forward to the Foreign Ministry, in particular to our Minister of Foreign Affairs? What message would you have to give?
Well, nothing different from what contained in our report.
Take your pencils out.
The report of the high-level independent panel on UN peace operations. I don't even remember the uniting our strengths, something like that. That's the title of our. In the report, if you go to it, you Google and you can download, you will see an introduction by me. The report I dedicate to a 3 or 4 year old girl called Nyakahat from South Sudan. I read about it in a Huffington Post, the story of that girl. In the height of the conflict a few years ago, she walked 4 hours on foot, guiding her blind father towards a UNICEF feeding center. She arrived there. A diligent UNICEF officer saw her, got her attention, and talked to her. And she was the one who did all the talking, this 4-year-old, explaining the situation. She was the one guiding her blind father. So I dedicate to this girl, and with 2 messages. The story of Nyakahat, one, is an indictment of the international community for the failure to prevent that conflict from happening, because South Sudan had enormous international presence there. How come? Because it's not that the UN was not present. It is not that the European Union, the US, and everybody were not present. Probably it had hundreds of specialists in conflict resolution. Why it happened? But at the same time, her story tells also a positive thing about the UN. If the UN were not there at all, for all the failings, she would be dead, many more people would have died. Many more people have died today, have died already in Sudan, South Sudan, if it were not for the, the flawed UN presence, for all the. So the UN, for all the flaws, the weaknesses, remain absolutely indispensable. That's how I would say the problem with peacekeeping. That's why our recommendation is, from the moment the Security Council agree to put on the agenda a given major security crisis in the world, well, it would have been already several years because, the Security Council, like you have a problem happening, it's not automatic, for different reasons. Finally, it goes to the consideration for Security Council. And hopefully, finally, they agree after a few days or few weeks of debate. From that moment, when the Security Council agreed to deploy an intervention force to stop bloodshed, it takes normally about 9 months for the first forces to be landing in the country concerned. The first units to land. Ideally, would have been like you have 2 weeks, So when we had a problem in my country in 2006, it was not a civil war, but I thought we better do something now before we should not take chances. So we didn't go to Security Council. We went to Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, and Portugal. We need your help to deploy here a special police force. So they did. And then we got Security Council to endorse it. Because if you go through the norm, so that's called first responders or coalition of the willing. And the coalition of the willing is not paid by assessed contribution. Each country paid their own cost or someone else paid the cost to them. But it is hoped that today, with the reforms, our recommendations, it might be possible to have an early deployment of troops, forces, before a conflict gets out of hand. But at the same time, the regional organization, and particularly sovereign entity, the country concerned, has to ask. The UN cannot simply decide to, let's send forces. They have not asked, but let's send, well, no, it doesn't happen like that.
Yeah, but we have UN representatives everywhere. So one wonders why then the UN representatives are not more proactive in requesting assistance. But I'm wondering whether in a country one needs 16,000 peacekeepers, whether one should not, judging from your experience, put more resources into institution building, making sure that rule of law exists and that also the root causes can be tackled. Like in many cases, environmental problems are really the driver of conflict.
Well, the UN is essentially a political security institution. The UN, even in taking consideration, UNDP is not a development institution. UNDP doesn't have money. UNDP goes to the European Union. I'll just tell you a story. When I was foreign minister, I had a young, I don't mention nationality, I mention a young European lady working for me as my advisor. And after, when 6 years, 7 years later, she asked me, and she was, dilemma, should I apply to work with the European Union or the UN? I told her, I said, listen, be realistic, be practical. Go to the European Union because they are the ones who have the money. you go to the UN, you have to end up going to Brussels asking for money. So she went to Brussels, and she's still there today. So this only to say there is a division of labor. The institutions that deal with development infrastructure, be the World Bank, Asian Development Bank in the Asian region, African Development Bank, and other institutions like that. They are the ones who should do that. In the case of Timor, there was a very good synergy between the UN and the World Bank, ADB, and the individual member states. Each knew exactly what they are supposed to do. But even then, sometimes overlap, duplication, and so on, but you cannot have a totally perfect system. So sometimes in some countries that I have served before, there is this disillusionment with the UN, partly because they misunderstand the role of the UN. The UN is not there to undertake responsibilities in terms of development, creating jobs. The UN is more like a catalyst. And, number one is security, political, and so on. Number two, yes, mobilize resources, put pressure on member states, on the donors. Yeah. And when I was in Guinea-Bissau, well, that's what I did. I went beyond my responsibilities. You know, I knew I did have money as a special representative of the Secretary General. But I would go beyond my mandate. I would phone a prime minister here and there, listen, can you send me, can you give me $500,000 for this and that and that? And so I would actively lobby to deliver some basic things right away to the communities. Yeah, that you can do. And the Secretary General allow you to do it. Yes, be creative, be proactive, do it. But limited, because the real job of developing infrastructures and all of that, education, agriculture, food security, that is long-term and belong to donor countries, the government concerned, donor countries, the banks, I mean, like African Development Bank or Asian Development Bank, not the UN as such.
Yeah, nevertheless, I'm rather impatient when I see that 16,000 peacekeepers are in Sudan for 10 years. You know, in the meantime, something could have happened more on the peace building and the development side, and that there is no link between the Khartoum development program and the Darfur situation is somehow amazing. Just one figure before opening now the floor for your questions that I would leave with you is that at present, global military spending stands at $1 trillion US. Then ODA, Official Development Assistance, amounts to 130 billion, which, if I'm not mistaken, is 10% of the military spending then. And humanitarian assistance amounts to 13 billion for all the poor and all the crises in the world. And not only 13 billion, but the requirements, the appeals for funding amount to the 26 billion. So all humanitarian assistance appeals are underfunded by 50%. And I must say, in view of the military spending and whatever else we do, it is very amazing to me to see these figures. Then in addition, knowing that the environment, as you also said, is a driver of conflict, of migration, that a country like Germany and many others goes slow and step back from our developmental goals, I find amazing, embarrassing, I must say. And we should always think that we all signed the 2030 Development Agenda. Leaving nobody behind is the first goal of the development agenda. So my feeling, at least, is that we are leaving hundreds and hundreds, thousands and billions even behind. And one message probably that could emerge from this discussion here, and maybe from your further interventions, is that we really must do better in terms of being serious about not leaving too many people behind. With that, let me see who wants to intervene. I saw over there the first question in the first row here, and I would suggest we always take 3 questions, and please say who you are when you raise your question. So you, and then the 2 here. No, over there first.
Thank you. My name is Gerrit Kurtz. I'm a PhD student at King's College London. Thanks a lot for your lecture, Excellency. It was really fascinating insights about your very impressive work. 2 quick questions about your more recent work. First, on the HIPAA report that you already mentioned. You said that you are quite satisfied with how the Secretariat dealt with your recommendations. But are you also satisfied with how member states dealt with your recommendations? Did they also listen as carefully as Gutteres did? And secondly, you're also a member of Secretary General Gutteres' high-level advisory board on mediation, which he introduced as his push for prevention, basically. I would be interested in your experience now that this board has met several times, what is discussed and what contribution can this board make to prevention at the UN? Thank you.
Now, who comes first here?
Hello, my name is Abdullah. I come from Syria, and I'm a student of politics at Bard College Berlin. I would like to thank you for your inspiring speech just moments ago. I have a question. You said national reconciliation was the greatest thing to bring about peace in your country, and I think in many different conflicts. So in the case of my country, it's been almost 9 years, ongoing war, and it's brutal war, and the losses were incredible. How can we achieve this national reconciliation in the context of the Syrian war? Sometimes I feel it's not possible. Sometimes I think I should be more optimistic, but I need some advice, some from experts in this field. Thank you very much.
So my name is Lilas. I'm also from Syria, and I'm a Bard student as well. My question is also related to Syria, of course. As my colleague just said, that after 8 years or 9 years of war going on in Syria, how would the UN proceed in doing developments in Syria? Because, as you know, now the situation might never end. So if development will start in Syria, the political situation will be established, and then the government or the dictatorship in Syria will remain as it is, and they will understand that there's no consequences for the action that has been done for the last 9 years. But on the other hand, if the country just stayed as it is and no development plan will be managed in Syria, Syria will be just, it's Iraq right now. There's no education, many refugees inside Syria and outside. And how do you think that this will be solved?
Want to take this 3?
On the, I'm no longer on the high-level board of mediation of the Secretary General. It was a 2-year, September, October 2017 to 2019. But I quit because I'm, of all the members, I'm the only one at the edge of the wall. And every time there's a meeting, I have to travel all the way to Helsinki, to New York, when others, you know, they are flying in from Europe, from whatever. So just this is But I stay in touch with the Secretary General privately and particularly reporting to him on developments in my own country. So I'm no longer involved. But the Secretary General took seriously his own conviction on prevention. You know, he didn't wait to read our report. Being who he is, I know him personally for many, many years. I know his mind, so he didn't need anyone to tell him that prevention, that he has to focus, the UN has to focus more on how to assist in preventing conflicts. And we all know, you know, easier said than done, as I explained earlier. You know, sometimes we can see the seeds of conflict being planted through policies, you know, through legislation, through discrimination. You can feel the tensions in the community. And sometimes we even alert the leaders concerned. And they dismiss it. So this happens all the time. So the Secretary General, all the way from New York, very difficult. He or anyone, any UN mission, you know, or regional mission, to really help in prevention. What the UN can do, that has been my advice, is identify institutions, individuals, in some of the more critical countries, or in the countries surrounding that particular country that you want to focus on, and provide them support so that they can organize themselves, they can start activities related to prevention of conflicts. Because there are many communities who do that. When I was in Guinea-Bissau, representing the Secretary General, one thing that impressed me most was how the people there, and these are humble people, simple people in the community, and I visit extensively all these communities. I walked through the villages, chatting with the people. It was amazing how peaceful it was in these communities. They don't allow the violence orchestrated by leaders, political leaders, military leaders, to come to descend to their community. They don't allow anyone to manipulate. So how then, so I would deal with them often. So the UN has to identify, and the UN or the European Union, institutions that have resources, to provide support to civil society, to NGOs, and not only national NGOs. I know there are some international NGOs that have been doing remarkable work in the field. Right now in Thailand, in southern Thailand, there are conflict there. In Myanmar, a lot of NGOs, international NGOs, doing the work, and sometimes easier for an individual, easier for an NGO to do conflict prevention initiatives than the UN, because the UN is too visible. You mention the UN, the government is immediately upset. But if it's an NGO, individuals, you can get away. So that's how, and so the UN should identify these people, and there are. The other question, sorry.
Did member states listen to the HIPAA report?
Yes, they did. We did, I have to say, we did extensive consultations. No one complained that they didn't, we didn't listen to them. Member states, civil society, think tanks, etc. So they were very pleased. There are, of course, some nuances, some details, which was really sometimes I was amazed. Conflict prevention it's supposed to be totally innocent. But one country, during the debate in General Assembly, he said, we hope that conflict prevention is not an excuse to interfere in the internal affairs of a country. So that was one. I don't mention the name of the country. So there is suspicion about that. And as you know, there have been controversy about a UN responsibility called the responsibility to protect. There is, and that happened with the Libya situation. When the situation in Benghazi was invoked, imminent threat to civilian population in Benghazi. So you need to protect civilian population there. Russia and China then abstain to enable a resolution Security Council. Well, from a responsibility to protect, it became a regime change. So these send alarms all over. No more falling into this. So it really did a lot of damage to the trust among the member states that would excuse of protection civilian. But when you deal with situation like I remember, talking with some top military commanders, peacekeeping in Congo, a Brazilian general, very top professional. His answer was, it's not only a responsibility. For me, if I'm in the field, if there is need to protect civilians, it's my moral obligation to do it. If you ask Rwanda, people in Rwanda, they completely agree with the duty, the responsibility to protect, for obvious reasons. But you ask others, they say, it is an avenue for regime change, avenue for interference. So there is no completely peaceful. Syria, God, who am I to tell you anything? Yeah, and a few years ago I was in Geneva. I was there with the former President Marty Ahtisaari. That was already 6-7 years ago. A question was asked of me, to me about Syria, and I gave a painful, honest answer. I didn't want to give politically correct answers. I said, I'm sorry, I have to say, there are wars that will go on forever. Many more people will die. It will stop when everybody is exhausted. This is what happened in Iran-Iraq war. It went for 8 years. More than 1 million people killed in the Iran-Iraq war. And then they negotiate and the war ended. And it was easier in Iran-Iraq war because really there are two powerful institutions there. When Saddam Hussein decided, we sue for peace, it happened. When Khomeini or Khamenei said, well, it happened. Because there are strong state institutions, leaders that made a decision. Syria, as you know, a lot of interference. So that's, you don't have only Assad, you have many other regional interests. So I'm not able to. But then, to give you an answer, but on reconciliation, well, I have to say, painful, but you have no choice. If you want to rebuild the country, rebuild communities, rebuild families, you don't forget, obviously, because no one is going to pass a legislation, national or international, to say, forget. But you have to have the courage to say, I'm not going to allow my anger, the hatred, the violence of the past to dominate our present. Because this is what happened with us in Timor. You know, many people died proportionally to the population. Our very, very high. And yet we decide forgive each other at national level and reconcile with Indonesia. And that's why the Indonesian side absolutely was surprised, pleased, that we understood their own problems. In the sense, we said Indonesia also came out of a dictatorship in 2008, 2009. 98, 99, the end of the dictatorship. And it was not easy, the transition to democracy in Indonesia. So we should not, Timorese side, start going for an international tribunal that would exacerbate the situation in Indonesia. So we refused, and even though we were criticized.
But you had an advantage. You are a very small country and very homogeneous compared to the situation in Syria. No? So shall we take a few more? I apologize, there are the hands up. I know we are beyond time, but I think you all agree that wine can wait and peace comes first. So I saw I take the hands the way I saw it. I saw this hand and that hand and here in front, and then I take a second round. Oh, yeah, sorry. Syrian? So we had already two. Yeah, you with your green jacket. No, wait.
Hello, my name is Bettina Lüscher. First of all, thank you for your service, not only to your country, but to the world. We never thank men like you and women enough who have done so much and have given up so much of their lives to serve those that need us. When I joined the UN 15 years ago, we were really worried about three big crises.
Ask questions so that more have a chance.
We were worried about three big, difficult crises. Now we have like 7 huge humanitarian crises. Today in Geneva, they are asking for $4 billion for Yemen. We're going to feed like double as many people as the World Food Programme did than last year. For Yemen, what is your analysis? What is your advice? What can the world do to end this horrible disaster?
The second one there. Shall we take more than 3?
Oh, hi, my name is Daniel. I'm a Hertie student, and I want to ask you kind of the same about the most forgotten conflict in Africa, which is Western Sahara. I mean, I think your conflict, your background, your Timor-Leste, it's kind of similar to this one. There's an oppression side. They've been colonized, oppressed for 30 years. So what can we learn from that? Thank you.
Yeah, the front row. Not front, but more or less front.
Ursula Schäfer-Preuß, UN Women, German National Committee. I've been in development cooperation for all my life. Thanks a lot for your presentation and your insights on the processes in your own country and the relationship with Indonesia and Timor-Leste. I wonder, as you made really a very strong plea for prevention of conflicts in the overall UN Security Council reform. And we do have now via Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. And I do wonder, as women are so important in the overall environment to prevent conflicts, how we can move on there. Would you have some recommendations for us in particular, as Germany is co-sponsoring a resolution on that during the Security Council session right now? Thank you.
I would say we take 3 more and then try to bundle them. Yes, the 2 there in the back.
Hello, my name is Livia. I come from Brazil. And I am happy to see how my country contributed from the birth and the formation of Timor-Leste within our possibilities, of course. And my question comes exactly there. How do you see South-South cooperation contributing for peace building and peacekeeping in the world? What is the role that differentiates South-South cooperation from North-South cooperation or institutions in this matter?
Thank you to President Ramos-Horta. My name is Anwar. I'm from Indonesia. So this is my personal experience. I have two cousins, one from my mother's side, one from my father's side. They work in Timor-Leste as teachers, and after the referendum, they were forced back home to Java. And at that time, I could sense there were a lot of angers, there were a lot of frustrations and hatred. And I could also imagine that it was also happening on the other side. So my question is that you said that the fighters and the leaders, they could restrain themselves to demonize the opponents, in this case is Indonesia. How did you do that, and how did you pass it on to the grassroots level? Because we can see today that to demonize our opponent is very easy. Let it be the immigrants, the LGBT community, those who have different religions. So that's my question. Thank you.
And quickly here. Short
Hello?
question.
So my name is Sushan. I'm from Nepal, and this is a question that's a bit different. But the climate change is happening, and there's glacial flooding happening all over my country right now. And in such a time, how is the UN working together with government institutes to really fight against climate change? Because this doesn't really come on the news, and we don't really know what's going on. So as a part of the UN, what are you doing, and what is the UN doing to tackle climate change on a global scale? Thank you.
Maybe I start with you, that I remember the question, because there are...
I can remind you.
So, we had the Paris Treaty and the subsequent Marrakesh and so many others. Each country, we committed ourselves to the national development, the national action plan, so that every country contributing, delivering on the promises as we signed the Paris Treaty to lower CO2 emission. And as I was in Paris at that time, leading our delegation in a press conference, I said, our CO2 emission is like 0, 0, 0, 0. I told the journalists, you can add any zero you want, how it is happening. So, but still, we also have responsibilities. We also cut trees. We also dump garbage everywhere. We also victims of garbage that come from elsewhere and land on our shores. So no matter we have a greater or less responsibilities, each of us must do what we have to do to save our forests, to replant, to clean our rivers, our lakes. So if we do it just in our own country, without always, blaming others, pointing fingers at the US, at the Europeans, or at China, at India, because these are the biggest polluters. Yeah. So that's each of us in our own country, because that's part of the treaty. National action plan to mitigate, to replant and all. Then you have the problem of countries that don't have resources. Well, that's when the richer countries so far have failed. Or when they have delivered the money to a fund, they make it so difficult for communities, for countries like ours to apply and get necessary assistance to for the different activities like mitigation, adaptation, and all of that. So what was the other question?
Yeah, if I could quickly add to this. A big problem in the environmental field is that the developing countries are expected to take a loan for CO2 reduction, which is totally nutty, because if you reduce CO2 emissions in Nepal or somewhere, they go into the atmosphere and I benefit too. So I should pay you for at least 50% of the CO2 emissions reduced. So I find we are really working there against our own interest, because then the consequences of climate change hit us. So that, in brief, the questions were Yemen. What the biggest disaster at present, probably?
Yeah. It is the most abominable failure of the international community. And I cannot understand how in the midst of that conflict, some countries still transfer weapons to the different sides of the conflict. You know, in the midst of, you would notice as students, as researchers, academics, one industry that did not suffer at all from the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, precisely the weapons industry, exponentially increased. So I can only say in desperation, in shame as a human being, how it have come to the situation like Yemen. Of course, Yemen leaders, the different leaders in the country, yeah, they are responsible. Like South Sudan, we cannot blame the UN or failure of the international community. We do blame. But how about the two leaders, the president and the vice president, who led all this civil war? How were they not able to sit down and talk? So anyway, my answer didn't really, doesn't help the situation. I just say, I surrender, in shame. You asked about Western Sahara. And I'm very familiar with the situation in Western Sahara. The positive thing about it all, is that war has not resumed. They agreed on a referendum that never happened. The Polisario forces, based on the other side, in Tindouf for Algerian side, and not in Algerian side, in Western Sahara territory that's not occupied by Morocco, they decide to freeze the war way back already 20 years. In spite of the frustration, neither side has resorted to settle for once and for all. The Secretary General has appointed more recently former President of Germany as he is a special representative. You cannot get a more important special representative than the former President of Germany. Is a bit like, if between the President of Germany and inviting me, is a bit like inviting, first-class soccer player and someone in the audience. So the Secretary General did, the Secretary General, because he did on purpose, I believe, to have someone like former President of Germany as his special representative, and the President accepted. Well, that brings a lot of pressure on the parties involved. And so that's all I can say.
The women and peace.
Well, I go by, let's say, by my own country. We are very new democracy, but I would say in Timor Leste we have I think almost to 37% of parliamentarians are women. And many cabinet members are women. At the civil service, it's still very limited, those who are at the top leadership. Because civil service started years ago, wrong, male-dominated. So where we could make the political decisions, we made the political decisions, and so we have a large representation of women. But that's not enough. They have to be also in economics, in business, and they are very, very active. Now, in terms of, I look at the situation in Liberia. Women in Liberia played a very critical role in forcing men to end the conflict.
Because there was a tough woman to begin with.
Yeah, there were quite a so, and that happened in many countries, in Guinea-Bissau and in my own country. And that's why the Secretary General started with Ban Ki-moon, to be fair, but with Antonio Gutteres, there's an increasing number of senior positions at the level of Under-Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General for women undertaking this. And some are in a very critical position, like in Iraq, I think, was a woman, very impressive.
Mali. Could we have your support if I were to suggest the following? Since you mentioned Germany will table in the Security Council a resolution on women in crisis situations. This resolution has, as so many UN resolutions, no financial statement attached. It's just words. No? So could we have your support for suggesting to the minister that maybe he could get a budget to implement this resolution, and then the money could, for example, go to UNDP or somewhere, and so that we actually can strengthen the women and not only have words again. Would you support us?
If that helps, yes. No problem. No,
your word counts.
No problem.
I'm getting signs that we should come to an end. I don't know why, because some...
Yeah.
The Indonesian question, and probably very quickly Brazil. And then we go for the wine. It will get hot otherwise.
As I said in my remarks, we did have an armed struggle, fighters, valiant fighters that fought against the Indonesian army. Many Indonesian young men lost their lives in the battlefield in Timor. The cemeteries are there. But our first leader of the country is Nicolau Lobato, a super charismatic individual. He died in combat. And he always said, from day one, we are not fighting the Indonesian people. We are fighting for freedom, for independence. We are not fighting the Indonesian people. And all these years, you would never see in our discourse, statements, anything demonizing the Indonesian side. And that's why after independence, it was easier to lead our people to reconciliation, to accept. It was not 100% so peaceful, because we have civil society, many of our NGOs would criticize us for not supporting international tribunal, etc., etc. But we resisted that. And I remember speaking to many young people in my country one day, a number like this, several hundred people. I said this: when we fought for independence, we fought because we believed in it, because of convictions. But we also fight with our brains. So when we fight for human rights, for justice, we fight because we believe. But you also have to fight with your brains. Meaning what? Well, sometimes justice has to be postponed. Has to wait. When you are in a conflict, and the conflict has to end through negotiations, You cannot then expect the other side, well, one point in the agreement with you to end this conflict is that you will all go to jail. Well, so we rejected an international tribunal. And because in Indonesia, at the time, there were a lot of problems. In Ambon, Kalimantan, Buginese, Dayaks, Muslims, Christians in Ambon, the military is still powerful. And then if we bring in the issue of international tribunal, God, create havoc in Indonesia. It would mean we don't understand the delicate transition in Indonesia. So the Indonesian military, the Indonesian leaders were very appreciative of that. Because some they thought we were going to be rabid radicals and we want justice, revenge. No, we said no. That's why we developed this great relationship. Even at people-to-people level. I tell you anecdotes. If you are from somewhere else in Southeast Asia, you're a young person, you go to Indonesia, you overstay the visa, you are arrested, you put in jail. If it's a Timorese, and our young people do this all the time, they forget always to look at the visa, the passport, and then they get to immigration, the passport had expired, the visa had expired, but because he is a Timorese, the Indonesian immigration, okay, go. So even at the people level, tremendous understanding, sympathy towards. And the Brazilian talk about South-South cooperation. Well, it's not a new phenomenon. Many countries have done that, and we do this also with Brazil and other countries. Trilateral arrangement. For instance, a third world country may have a lot of qualified people to help us, but don't have the finances. So we get experts, whether from Thailand, from Indonesia, from Philippines, or wherever, from Africa, but financed by Japan or by the European Union. They pay for it. So we do this trilateral arrangement. And we have, in my country, we have had people from all over the world. We have even one economist from Gambia, little country in West Africa. He was one of our top economists. He was paid by the World Bank to advise us. And we have people from all over the world. Now less, as we educate our people, we send hundreds of Timorese to study in Thailand, Indonesia, Australia, with our own scholarships. Now they're the ones taken over.
Yes, thanks very much. And I think since we want to have some concrete outcomes from this discussion, I heard actually 3 messages emerge. The one that you repeated several times is that one should enter into fair negotiations, open-minded negotiations, aim at reconciliation. Don't push your opponent or interlocutor into a corner. The second message was that we should all do our part and not just blame others for things not happening, but show solidarity and take our fair share. And when it comes to fair share taking, I think we heard from you that maybe the donor governments or the countries who can afford it should consider financing peace observers or conflict observers from civil society or at least independent personalities. That would be one initiative to support more women so that they can help enter into the peace support. And then there was a third point that came out strongly, that maybe we think twice about weapons and military exports, where we send them to. We have rules, but the rules don't seem to be working so well so that we can prevent Yemen's of the future. So, Mr. President, thanks for all these thoughts, for this encouragement and the challenges. It was very nice to have you. Thank you very, very much.